Hi everyone, and welcome to another fractions video. So today I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to bring it all the way back to basics, and I'm going to start at the beginning and ask you the question, what is a fraction? So up until the point that students are introduced to fractions, you have to remember that they've been working with whole numbers. And a lot of the rules that are applied to whole numbers don't always necessarily apply to fractions. So there's one thing that you have to keep in mind when you're teaching students fractions, and that is to remind them that a fraction is actually a number that falls between whole numbers. So that's the whole idea about what a fraction is. As well as this, it is a part of a whole. So when we're looking at first introducing students to fractions, we're getting them to work with fractions in terms of making their fractions and looking at the part, which is the numerator, out of the whole. Now the whole is dependent on the unit that you're using. In this case, my whole is this square piece of paper, but my whole could be a number line, as I've got here. My whole can be a collection of counters. My whole can also be a lump of Play-Doh. So you always have to make sure you bring it back to the whole that you're working with. The number of parts that I partition my whole into makes up my denominator. Students need practice at labeling these two parts. So when I will first give students that introduction to fractions, I talk about, here is my whole, and I want to work out 3/4 of my whole. So if I partitioned my whole into quarters and I take 3 of those quarters, what would that look like? Now, sometimes I think that it may be better to start with a set model or a number of counters, because that way it's real for them. But in this case, a lot of the times we do begin with area. So if you were to begin with area, I would do it this way. So I would go, okay, so my whole now is broken up into 4 parts, and I want to take 3 of those 4 parts. So I want to see what that looks like. So this is what my 3/4 of my whole will look like. So they can shade that region, each one of those parts. And that is 3 out of my 4 parts shaded. But I also want to talk about it in terms of the size of what this would be. I would also get them to take the same piece of paper and ask them to show you 3/4 of this, but in a different way. Now, this could be challenging for some students, but there are 2 more. Actually, there are a number of ways they could do this, but here's another way they could fold into quarters. And when they open it up again, they've got 1, 2, 3. That is 3/4. So both of these represent 3/4. You could then ask them, show me another way you can partition this into quarters to show me 3/4. Now this can be a bit challenging for some students, but give them some thinking time, and I'm going to let you in on a secret, and that is if they fold it along the diagonal. This is why I love using square bits of paper, because they are perfectly symmetrical and we can actually fold along the diagonal and get perfect equal triangles, not equilateral, equal size. So you can see here is another way of folding into quarters, and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oops, 5, 1, 2. So that's my 3/4. So 3/4, 3/4, 3/4. So you can do this with various fractions. It just gives the mind a bit of an idea of that a fraction is not a set number like whole numbers. It's a part of a whole or of a unit. So it's dependent on what I start with. So if I started with a circle, my quarters would look very different. So now I've got 3 parts with a circle look like this. So expose them to different models and methods of making the same fraction. The more practice they get at these different models, the better. Another way of doing it is to give them a collection of 4 counters and ask them to show you 3/4 of those 4. But start with the area model first, move into the number line, because remember, you want the students to understand that 3/4 is a number that falls between 0 and 1. So if I had my number line and I have 0 on one side and 1 on the other, let's practice how to partition our number line into quarters and then label our 3/4 onto our number line. So I always start with getting the students to practice their benchmarking. So start with their benchmark number and then move into that. So this is 1/4, this 1/2 will be 2/4, and this will be 3/4. So when they are learning to use a number line, they have to remember that a number line is a little bit different to a part whole. Although each of these parts represents a quarter of the whole of one, we don't label it like this: a quarter, a quarter, a quarter, a quarter. That's actually one of the misconceptions. So the fractions are labeled on the ticks that appear on the number line. So it's like this length model, as we start at 0 and we move along the number line like we're walking along a track. So that means that my 1/4 will be 1, 2, 3, and I end up here at 3/4. So 3/4 of my number line is this distance here. That's how I would start introducing fractions. Get them to practice 1 fraction or 2 fractions in lots and lots of different ways. Stay tuned for some more fractions videos coming up. Until then, have a great time. I'll see you next time. Bye.